There are a lot of things that we can look at, and certainly things that we want to give consideration to as we look at events in the world around. I want to focus our attention here this afternoon on some things that are going on in the world scene, to understand a little bit of the times in which we're living, the times that we find ourselves, and not only to understand the times that we find ourselves in, that's important, but if you understand the times in which we find ourselves without understanding the response that God is expecting of us, it doesn't do much good to know where you are if you don't know what you're supposed to do while you're there. And as we look around, we find that there are a lot of things that are happening. We're living in a time that really represents the prelude to the final events that Christ talked about in Scripture. We see many things that are going on the world scene. There a lot of things we could look at. There are actually three particular things that occurred after the Feast of Tabernacles and prior to the first of the year. And I might just briefly comment on those because they play a role in terms of prophetic events. In time sequence, perhaps the first thing that happened of significance between the feast and the first of the year was the death of Yasser Arafat. And the result, of course, was a change in the leadership in the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, there in the Middle East. Now, you might start out by saying, well, who cares who's the head of the Palestinian Authority? In fact, it's worth thinking about. Why does anybody care? If we read off a list of little countries there in the Middle East, and Palestine is not even a country. Palestinian Authority is not even a separate nation. They had an election, elected a president, a successor to Arafat. But, you start thinking about some of these little countries scattered around there, or you start naming off countries in that area. How many of them do you know the leader of? Most folks, you start talking about a place like Qatar, or even Kuwait, or Yemen, or Aden, or some of these places, and it's like, if any of those places have an election, most of them don't, but if any of them ever do, it doesn't really rate a whole lot of news over here. Now, there's a reason why people over here, why the United States government, why the news media over here, why the average American person is interested in the events occurring with the Palestinian Authority in a way that most of the other things over there, many of the other elections, don't receive a lot of note. Now, we're getting a lot of publicity about the Iraqi election, and that's, of course, because we're over there and we're in the middle of a quagmire. In fact, one of the programs I taped this past just over a week ago was entitled, Can America Police the World? Because, of course, that's what we find ourselves in the midst of. But there's a specific reason why the situation with the Palestinians is in the news, and that is mentioned right back here in the book of Zechariah, chapter 12. Zechariah was writing about 25 centuries ago. About 25 centuries ago. The context, of course, was the Jews were returning from Babylon, and they were coming back to Jerusalem, coming back to rebuild. The Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar had come in, had conquered Judea, had conquered Babylon, had eventually destroyed the city and taken the people into captivity. Several decades passed. Babylon itself fell to the Persians, and the Persian king Cyrus issued a decree that allowed the Jews to return and to begin rebuilding Jerusalem if they wished. Zechariah was one of the prophets that came back in that initial return. Zerubbabel was appointed the governor of the Babylonian or the Persian province of Judea. He led a group of a little over 40,000 people back, along with Joshua the high priest, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, and they all came back along with about 40,000 people or so. Now, that's the context in which Zechariah wrote. And so here, 25 centuries ago, Zechariah is writing in Zechariah chapter 12. And he said here in Zechariah 12, verse 1, The burden of the word of the Lord for Israel, says the Lord, which stretched forth the heavens and lays the foundation of the earth and forms the spirit of man within it. So we begin to look a little bit at the greatness and the grandeur of God. understand the God who is telling the future, the God who formed the heavens and the earth, the God who formed man in His own image and breathed into him the breath of life. He said, I will make Jerusalem a cup of trembling unto all the people round about when they're gathered together in the siege both against Judah and Jerusalem. In that day, I'm going to make Jerusalem a burdensome stone for all people. Now, it's interesting he used used the term a cup of trembling. A cup of trembling, or a bubbling, boiling cauldron. That's what's really being described. You know what? It was funny. I listened to the president on radio just a day or so ago, and he referred to Jerusalem. He referred to the Middle East as this bubbling cauldron. Well, it's an interesting choice of terms that he used, because that is the term that's used right here in Zechariah 12, a cup of trembling, or a cup of, of bubbling, of boiling, a boiling cauldron. That's what he's describing. The reason the Middle East is a bubbling, boiling cauldron is because of Jerusalem. And the reason why anybody cares about the situation with the Palestinians is because of Jerusalem. That is the focus of attention. You know, there's no, the Palestinians don't control any oil. They don't control any particular strategic thing. It is a situation that entirely revolves around the city of Jerusalem. Now, Zechariah talked about Jerusalem becoming a burdensome stone. He mentions in verse 6, in that day will I make the governors of Judah like a hearth of fire among the wood, like a torch of fire in a sheaf. And they're going to devour all the people round about on the right hand and on the left, and Jerusalem is going to be inhabited again in her own place, even in Jerusalem. Now, these events that he's describing in chapter 12 set the stage for what he says in chapter 14, that behold, the day of the Lord comes. And he talks about nations being gathered against Jerusalem to battle. And then in Zechariah 14:3, the Lord going forth and fighting against those nations. And in verse 4, His feet shall stand in that day on the Mount of Olives. Zechariah, over 25 centuries ago, was describing events that are for our time and the time ahead of us, that are going to culminate in the return of Jesus Christ and His feet standing on the Mount of Olives. Now, think about it for a little bit. From the time that Nebuchadnezzar's troops entered Jerusalem, from the time Nebuchadnezzar's troops entered Jerusalem and Jewish independence was lost and the Babylonians set up their government and controlled that area. And eventually Nebuchadnezzar's troops came back a couple of more times, the final time destroying the city and destroying the temple. All the years that went by, Jerusalem was never the central focal point. Look in modern history. You go back to the time when Columbus crossed the Atlantic and quote, discovered America. Was world attention focused on Jerusalem back in the 1400s? No. What about the 1500s, or the 1600s, or the 1700s, or the 1800s? Was world attention focused on Jerusalem? Was it a cup of trembling to all the people round about? Was it something that all the nations of the world were focused on? Absolutely not. Jerusalem was a small town. It was an obscure province in the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. Now, in the late 1800s, Jews from Europe began coming in, early part of the Zionist movement. They began coming into that area, buying up property and establishing collective farms, that sort of thing. In 1917, exactly 2,520 years, 7 prophetic times, exactly 2,520 years to the day, from the time Nebuchadnezzar's troops had first entered Jerusalem back in 604 B.C., in 1917, the British troops under General Allenby entered Jerusalem again. Actually, General Allenby was mounted on his big horse, and he got off the horse and he walked in the gate that brought him into Jerusalem to accept the surrender from the Turks. His statement at the time, he came up leading the troops and he got off and walked because he said he didn't want to ride where Christ had walked. But he came in and accepted surrender of the Turkish troops, and that was, of course, during World War I. Turkey was allied with Germany. And the British took over that area. And exactly this period of time had passed, this 2,520 years, since the Babylonians had first taken it. Jerusalem had been under foreign rule. Now, an interesting set of events took place because in the aftermath of General Allenby taking possession, the British government had just prior to that issued a decree, the Balfour Decree, drawn up by Lord Balfour, who was the British Foreign Secretary, stating that the British government would look with favor upon the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the province of Palestine, which was the Turkish province. Well, the Jews began to pour in increasing numbers, and right in the aftermath of World War II, in 1948, the State of Israel declared independence. And the exact moment that the State of Israel declared independence, the Arab League attacked from all directions. They fought to a standstill, and a truce was declared. But when the truce was declared, Jerusalem was not controlled by the Jews. The Arabs had possession of the old city of Jerusalem and the historic part. 19 years later, one 19-year time cycle later, in 1967, which interestingly was the 50th year, the Jubilee year, from the time that General Allenby had entered, there was another war called the Six-Day War. Now, it's an unusual war because it started on Sunday morning and ended on Friday afternoon before sunset. You don't have many wars that last only 6 days and start Sunday morning and end up in time to keep the Sabbath here on Friday afternoon. And in that particular war, one of the remarkable things that happened was the entire Syrian Air Force, the entire Egyptian Air Force, the entire Jordanian Air Force were destroyed on the ground. Didn't even get their planes in the air. And Jerusalem was recaptured by the Jews. Now, you go back, if you don't remember, you ought to go back and read something about the story of the Six-Day War. It is a remarkable story. And if you wanted a brief one-verse description of it, you could use Zechariah 12:6. I'm going to make the governors of Judah, like a hearth of fire among the wood, like a torch of fire among the sheaves. They're going to devour all the people round about on the right hand and on the left, and Jerusalem is going to be inhabited again, even in her own place. Jerusalem was inhabited again. Jerusalem was a Jewish city for the first time since the Romans had destroyed it 2,000 years earlier. A remarkable story. A remarkable set of events. How is it that Zechariah could look 2,500 years, 25 centuries down the road from his day and be able to foresee certain things like that? Well, the one who said it wasn't Zechariah, it was the Lord, the one who stretched forth the heavens, laid the foundation of the earth, and placed the spirit of man within him. It was the Creator God. Now, that's why the events going on among the Palestinians and the events going on in Israel, that's why those things are important. Because Jerusalem has become a burdensome stone to all the nations round about. Everybody that gets involved with it, it becomes a burdensome stone. Just sort of cuts things up, and they don't know what to do with it. It's they grab hold, and it's easier to grab hold of than it is to turn loose of. And that is the source of the bubbling, boiling cauldron in the Middle East. And the dynamics of what is happening there have changed. There have been certain leaders that have dominated the scene for a long time. There are leaders on the world scene that have played a particular role. And when God's time comes, those leaders pass from the scene. Sometimes the man who takes their place is merely an interim figure, somebody else to serve a short-term purpose. But events in the Middle East, a change took place with the passing of Yasser Arafat and the events that are going on that are going to set the stage for the things that are going to happen next. Because there's some very significant things in the Middle East. Now, there's another event that has happened during the time between the Feast of Tabernacles and the first of the year. And it was, my attention was drawn to that on a trip to Charlotte just very shortly after the Feast of Tabernacles. And I read an article in a British magazine. I picked it up at the airport and was reading it on the airplane. And an article caught my attention about an event that was going on in Eastern Europe. And sort of got my focus on it, and I have followed it. It's not gotten a lot of news. It's not something that has tended to make the front pages of our newspaper, and yet I think we're going to see that the events are going to prove very significant. That is the fact that there was an election in Eastern Europe, an election in the Ukraine, that has brought a new government to power. Now, you may wonder, why in the world would we care who the president of the Ukraine is? Well, there's some reasons as to why that might be significant. One of the article that originally caught my attention talked about this election going on in the Ukraine, and they mentioned the opposition candidate, a fellow by the name of Yushchenko. And they said, you know, he is really planning to take, if he gets elected, he wants to take the Ukraine in a totally different direction. He wants to integrate them with Europe. He is seeking membership in the European Union. He wants to be a part of Europe. But the article went on to say the deck is stacked against him. Doesn't appear much chance that he's going to get elected, even though he's very popular. Well, a short time after that, I noticed there was a news item. This particular fellow had sort of disappeared from view. He, in the middle of the election, he just sort of disappeared. Turned out a few days later he was in a hospital down in Vienna, Austria, of all places. Was deathly ill. Thought he was going to die for a while, and then eventually he gets out of there, and he shows back up and campaigns. Very disfigured. He's something horrible has happened. He was very, very sick, but he shows up again and he campaigns. They have the election, and typically, attempt at a stolen election. They stuff the ballot boxes. You got towns where more people voted than there were the entire population of the town. Anyway, guess what? He lost. But he didn't lose for long. Within days, people began to pour into Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine. They didn't bring guns. They didn't start a riot. Just poured in, surrounded the parliament, surrounded the offices of government. The Ukrainian government, which had heavily supported this other fellow, the man that ran against him, the, quote, president-elect, they'd stuff ballot boxes, use the army, the whole thing. They began to get so increasingly nervous that they finally backed down and said, you know, there may have been a few problems with that election. Tell you what, we'll just run it all over again. Now, how often does that happen? In the meantime, the doctors in Vienna had consulted with some doctors in London and various experts, and they came out and they said, you know what this fellow had? This Yushchenko, he had dioxin poisoning. He had 4,000 times the amount of dioxin in his body that what you can normally get from just eating something that was contaminated. He was poisoned. Almost died. Turned out he'd been having dinner at some official gathering, and I guess he was sitting at a table that one of the fellows who was the head of what used to be called the KGB was right there. So they had slipped him something, and he almost died, but he didn't. But he showed up disfigured and everything. You could tell that he'd gone through a horrible situation. They ran the election over again, and he won by 8 million votes. He was sworn into office this past Sunday. And immediately he went to Russia the next day and then turned around and went to Europe and has applied for admission into the European Union. Now, you may say, well, what is the significance of that? Well, you know, one of the interesting things when you look at Daniel chapter 2, you know, one thing to understand in the opening part of the book of Daniel is you consider the mindset of people. Remember, Daniel was brought into captivity. The Babylonians had invaded Judah. They had taken the city of Jerusalem. They had made Judea a tributary province in the Babylonian Empire. They had looted the place and hauled off things that were of value, as well as a number of young men that were brought to Babylon. Daniel was in that group of young men. You know, the way people would have looked at it at the time, certainly the way Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians looked at it, was that obviously Babylon was the greatest and the gods of Babylon were superior to everything else. Because after all, hadn't all these nations tried to fight and maintain their independence, and Babylon had conquered them all one by one. So Nebuchadnezzar was pretty proud of himself. And clearly the gods of Babylon were the greatest. Because one of the ways they did that in the various foreign countries that they attacked, they would take the idol that these nations worshipped and would bring it to the temple of Marduk in Babylon. And they would set it up there as a trophy. And so it was like their God presided over all the others. Well, they didn't have a statue that they could bring from Jerusalem, but they brought the treasures of the temple. Well, Daniel hadn't been in Babylon all that long before Nebuchadnezzar had a very troubling dream. And he was unable to tell anybody exactly what he dreamed, but it really bothered him, troubled him. There was a lot of upset. He got mad when nobody could tell him what he had dreamed and what it meant. Finally, Daniel came in. And Daniel made it plain. You can read the story in Daniel chapter 2. Daniel made it plain. He said, there is a God in heaven that is a revealer of secrets. And he has declared to the king what will be in the latter days. So, the God that Daniel served, the real God, saw the future in advance. Declared the end from the beginning. Far from Nebuchadnezzar's triumph being showing the superiority or the supremacy of the God that he worshipped, Daniel revealed through this plan, through this interpretation of a dream, that the God that he served, the God of Israel, had a plan. Nebuchadnezzar just happened to have a little part in that plan. Nebuchadnezzar occupied his role because the God whom Daniel served had set it up so. He told Nebuchadnezzar, he said, you saw an image. That's what you dreamed. You saw this great impressive image on the plains of Shinar, and it had a head of gold and shoulders of silver and belly and thighs of brass. It had legs of iron, and it had feet that were a mixture of iron and ceramic clay. Then you saw a stone that was cut out without hands, a stone of supernatural origin. That stone came down from the heavens and smashed the image on its toes. The whole image turned to dust, blew away, and that stone then became a great mountain, filled the whole earth. He said, now that's what you dreamed, and let me explain the interpretation. He said, you, O king, you are the head of gold. That's the starting point of the vision. But he said, after you, there's going to arise another kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was at its height. It was at a height of power and grandeur. And what the God of heaven was able to say is, your kingdom isn't going to last. That's not permanent. There's going to arise another kingdom after you. And then there's going to arise a third kingdom. And then there's going to arise a fourth kingdom. And that fourth kingdom, that fourth empire, likened to iron, comes down as two legs and has as its final, the final aspect of it, the 2 feet, the 10 toes. And it's in the days of those final kings, those final 10 toes, those final 10 kings, that the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be removed. So the other kingdoms were going to be removed. They were all temporary. They had a place in the sun, but it was a short-term place, a temporary place. But ultimately, the God of heaven was going to set up a kingdom. The God that Daniel worshipped was going to set up a kingdom that would never pass away. And you know, that's exactly what happened. Babylon was succeeded by Persia, and Persia by Greece, and Greece by Rome. The fourth empire, fourth kingdom, the kingdom of iron, the Roman Empire. Mr. Armstrong commented many, many years ago on the fact that the significance of the 2 legs of iron was the fact that the Roman Empire continued through history as 2 legs, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. And that's right. Now, sometimes we have not always focused on the implications of that statement. But if you have 2 legs representing the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, you have 2 feet with 10 toes. There's no indication that one foot has all the toes and the other foot doesn't have any. Every indication would be that if you have 2 feet with 10 toes, you've got 5 toes on each foot. So you've got the successors of both the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire that constitute the final revival. Now we know historically, you know, the East-West divide, a lot of people think of that in conjunction with the Cold War. The East-West divide in Europe did not start with Stalin, it did not start with the Cold War. The East-West divide goes back to a period about 300 years after the time of Christ. The Roman Emperor Diocletian, who split the Roman Empire, divided the Roman Empire into 2 parts for administrative purposes, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. One of his successors, Constantine, built a new capital at the old site of the city of Byzantium. He called this capital, he named it New Rome, his contemporaries and others afterward called it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. So in the aftermath of Emperor Constantine, there were always two emperors. The emperor in the east, who ruled from Constantinople, and the emperor in the west, who ruled from Rome. Now, prophecy in the book of Revelation focuses on the western leg. You see, it was the western leg, it was the portion of the Roman Empire ruled from Rome that received a deadly wound, where the deadly wound was healed. That was the beast that was ridden by the woman described in Revelation 17. But historically, there was an east-west divide in Europe. It was religious, it was cultural, because you see, Western Europe took its culture from Rome. So you can go throughout Western Europe and you find the same alphabet used. Different languages spoken, but you find the same alphabet. It is the Latin alphabet that derives from Rome. You find that that area, Western Europe, was traditionally Catholic. So you find a Latin, Germanic, Catholic civilization that derives from Rome, that has dominated Western Europe as the outgrowth of the Western Empire. But when you look at Eastern Europe, you find a different civilization. A civilization that was the outgrowth from Constantinople. There were two brothers, Cyril and Methodius, who left Constantinople and went to, quote, evangelize and Christianize Eastern Europe. That's why you find today in the Ukraine, you find in Russia, you find in Bulgaria, you find in a number of nations, a different alphabet used than is used in Western Europe. If you ever see something printed in Russian or the languages of Eastern Europe, you will find that it's a different alphabet. It's not the Latin alphabet. It's what it's called Cyrillic, named for Cyril. It is based on Greek. It's based on the Greek alphabet, because that's what they used in Constantinople. You see, the civilization of Eastern Europe was Orthodox in religion. It was Greek and Slavic, deriving from Constantinople, just as Western Europe was Catholic and Latin and Germanic, deriving from Rome. And so the heirs of Caesar continued down through time, continued down historically. There were the heirs of the Eastern Roman civilization of the Eastern Europe, and the heirs of Western Roman civilization in the West. Now, what Daniel brings out, what Daniel makes plain that none of the other prophecies do, is that at the end, the final 10 toes, the final 10 kings, are going to represent the heirs of both Eastern and Western Rome. So, when the Iron Curtain came down in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapsed, that was part of that story. That was the beginning of it. A couple of years later, in 1991, when the hammer and sickle flag was lowered from atop the Kremlin and the communist government in Russia was ended, the Soviet Union was no more, and it began to fracture into constituent republics. Now, these events in the Ukraine, what you see, and I'm not trying to say exactly which 10 kings or 10 rulers and which exact nations are going to do this, but you're going to find a certain core in the European Union, 10 specific rulers who ultimately will give their power to the beast. And the stage is being set. There are events happening in Eastern Europe, bringing Eastern Europe so that the European Union is not simply a union of Western European countries, not simply a union of those who are the heirs of the Western Roman Empire, but also including those who are the heirs of the Eastern Roman Empire. The whole thing. Now, here was God declaring this when Daniel was written, 26 centuries ago. You see, that vision was given to Nebuchadnezzar about 600, actually a little before 600 B.C., 26 centuries ago. And we're getting down to the time when those final 10 toes are going to be extant, and they're the ones that Christ is going to destroy when He returns, and that whole system is going to pass away, and the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be removed. So, again, we see things that are happening on the world scene. Just before the first of the year, there was another matter that certainly brought Scripture to mind, and this was this horrible natural disaster in Asia. This terrible earthquake over 9 point. I think the last figure I saw was either 9.0 or 9.1 on the Richter scale. A massive earthquake setting off this huge tidal wave, the tsunami that was so destructive, evidently has left somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 people dead, and will have long-term implications. You know, it's really made me sort of call to mind the verse back in Luke chapter 21. Jesus is here talking about events, and he said in verse 25 of Luke 21, "There shall be signs in the sun, and the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things that are coming upon the earth. The very powers of the heavens are going to be shaken." You know, what we saw, the events in Southeast Asia are a mere prelude. They are just the tip of the iceberg about what's going to happen, because the main events of this sort are going to occur during the time of the day of the Lord, but they're going to occur with increasing frequency building up prior to that time. Tremendous natural disasters, earthquakes. A very apt description of a tsunami, the sea and the waves roaring. You know, distress of nations with perplexity. People are puzzled. They don't understand. It doesn't make sense to them. You see, we live in a world that does not want to acknowledge that there is a Creator God who has a plan and a purpose and who is going to intervene to judgment. There's a reason why people want to believe in evolution. One of the programs I did this past week was entitled, "Was Darwin Wrong?" Well, the answer was he absolutely was. I tell you what, I had fun with that program. National Geographic had done an article in November of November this past year, November 2004. And the cover article was Darwin Wrong? Well, not only was Darwin wrong, so was National Geographic. But I tell you, my favorite quote in there is they had this fella, he had dug up a little piece of bone. And he said in there how big the bone was. It was about the size of a lug nut. Now, I think everybody here knows how big a lug nut is. I went out and we got a lug nut off one of the cars in the parking lot there at the building in Charlotte. And because I wanted to make sure everybody knew how big a lug nut was. I wanted to hold one up right in front of the camera. Because this fella, he looked at this little bone, you know, a piece of petrified bone about the size of a lug nut, he said. And it suddenly dawned on him. You know what suddenly dawned on him? The similarity between whales and antelopes. Now, I don't know about you, but you know, if I look at a little piece of bone about yay big, and you figure out how close whales are related to antelopes from that, you've done some tall thinking. I mean, it's crazy, really crazy. And they had this. This was half of an ankle bone, or half of a part of an ankle bone. Anyway, this was really. This fellow thought he'd really come up with something. Though, you know, they had some classic quotes in there. They were talking about the fossil record and all the things they were finding. Though they admitted, even right there in the National Geographic article, they said, well, the fossil record is sort of like a film where 999 out of every 1,000 frames has been left on the cutting room floor. Now, if you saw a movie where 999 frames out of every 1,000 had been left out, how much would you know about the story? What would you be able to figure out if you saw something and only every 1,000th frame were up there? You wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about or what the movie was about. Well, anyway, there's a reason, though. You see, the reason people want to believe in evolution, the reason that the scientists and the educators want to believe in evolution, Peter talked about it back in 2 Peter chapter 3. And it ties right in with prophecy. Notice 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. Peter said, "This second epistle, beloved, I now write unto you, in both of which I stir up your pure minds by way of remembrance, that you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets." See, that's the Old Testament, the prophets of God, "and of the commandments of us, the apostles of the Lord and Savior." That's the New Testament. What the prophets wrote of old, what the apostles have written of more recent date, Peter says. "Knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust, and what will they say? Where's the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. You see, there are two explanations to the things that are written in the ground under your feet, to geology. There are two explanations. One of them is called uniformitarianism. That simply means all things have continued as they were since the fathers fell asleep. Everything has come along, and all the changes that have taken place have been very gradual, very incremental. It's all happened very slowly over a long period of time. Because you see, the other explanation is that there have been catastrophes, catastrophic interventions of the Creator into His creation. Well, that, you see, is what they don't want, because, why? Well, the scoffers, we're told in verse 3, are walking after their own lusts. They simply want to do whatever they want to do. They don't want somebody telling them how to live. They're walking after their own lusts. They don't want a God, because you see, if there's a Creator, then maybe that Creator has something to say about the way you and I ought to live. I mean, if evolution is true and man's only an animal, then why shouldn't he act like an animal? But if there is a Creator, then maybe that Creator has something to say about how we ought to live. And maybe that Creator has intervened in judgment. And if there's a record that He's intervened in judgment in the past, then maybe He's going to intervene in judgment again in the future and hold people accountable for what they've done and how they've lived. That they don't want to consider, and that is the bottom line as to why somebody would believe in something as foolish as evolution. That there's no way in the world it can't provide the story. So Peter said they're going to become these scoffers. They're going to say their theory is everything just continues as it always has been. There's not going to be any intervention. Peter then went on to say in verse 5, for this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water. You know, the time of creation. The world that then was overflowed with water, and it perished. The events of the flood. The heavens and the earth which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. Now, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing. One day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. And 1,000 years as one day. The Lord is not slack concerning His promise, as some men count slackness, but He's long-suffering to us, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. We find that God has a plan, and in God's plan, one day is like 1,000 years. Now, where are we first introduced to days? Well, you go back to Genesis chapter 1. You read the story of creation. And you read a day-by-day account of creation, coming all the way up to the sixth day. And at the point of the sixth day, the Lord God beheld all that He had made, and behold, it was very good. The evening and the morning were the sixth day. And then we're told that on the seventh day, God rested. And He hallowed the seventh day. He sanctified it. He set it apart. He blessed it. Now let me ask you something. Why was there 7 days of creation week? Did God work just as hard as He could and as fast as He could? And boy, He was huffing and puffing, but He finally, in 6 days, He got finished, and then He was tired, and He sat down and He rested. No. It took 6 days because God chose for it to take 6 days. In the process of creating the world that you and I see, God also created a measure of time, the week. And He used 6 days as time to do His work. And then on the seventh day, He rested. It was a Sabbath. Now, Peter said that the week is a type, represents God's plan. That in God's plan, which will culminate in God's judgment, there are 7 millennial days. 7 1,000 years. That's all millennium means, is 1,000. 7 millennial days, 7 1,000-year days. That's a day is with the Lord is 1,000 years. We know there's 7 of them. If you go back to Genesis 1 and 2, that's how many God established at creation. The Sabbath, the 7th day, was the day of rest. Is there coming a day of rest? Well, notice Isaiah 14. Is there coming a day of rest? You can know when it's coming, you can know when it's going to start, and you can know how long it's going to last. Isaiah 14, verse 7 describes it. It says, the whole earth is at rest. The earth is having a Sabbath. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Now, when is that going to occur? What's the time setting of Isaiah's prophecy in Isaiah 14? Let's go up to verse 3. Isaiah 14:3. It shall come to pass in the day. So here's the time setting. In the day that the Lord shall give you rest. So we're coming to the time when the whole earth is going to be at rest. In the day when the Lord shall give you rest from your sorrow and from your fear and from the hard bondage wherein you've been made to serve, that you shall take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how has the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. One who smote the people in wrath, and with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger, is persecuted, and none hinders. The whole earth is at rest. When is the oppressor going to cease? When will the golden city cease? Well, that story is told right, we see it indicated right here in Isaiah 14. If you want to go back to the book of Revelation, in chapter 17, we'll pick it up, Revelation 17, in verse 1. One of the angels John had seen earlier with one of the seven vials, came and talked with John and said, come here, and I will show you the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters. This great whore, why is she called a great whore? You know, she is typified as a woman who, verse 2, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. So John was carried out into the wilderness, and he saw a woman. The woman was sitting upon a scarlet-colored beast. And this beast had 7 heads and 10 horns, and it was full of the names of blasphemy. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, color of royalty. She was decked with gold and precious stones. She had a golden cup in her hand that was full of abominations. And she had a name on her forehead written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. The woman was drunk with the blood of the saints. She had been responsible for martyrdom of many, many of God's people. Now, we don't have to just do a lot of guessing. We're told very clearly that the woman, verse 18, was representative of that great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Which great city ruled over the kings of the earth when John was writing the book of Revelation? Well, Rome did. And we know that a woman is used in Scripture to represent basically the church. Israel in the Old Testament was represented as a woman who married God, married the Creator at Mount Sinai. The church, the New Testament church, is represented as a woman, the affianced bride of Christ, the virgin bride, waiting for the return of the Messiah, for the coming of the King, to whom she will be married. Here we find another woman described. A woman that is associated with a great city that rules over the kings of the earth, but a woman that is entered into, rather than having saved herself and been faithful, waiting for the Messiah, she has entered into all sorts of illicit relationships with political rulers. She really represents an outgrowth of the Babylonian mystery religion. She has been responsible for martyrdom. She is a mother, had many harlot daughters. The waters, verse 15, upon which the woman sat, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. What great church. Great multinational church that has influence over all sorts of different countries, all sorts of different peoples and nations and languages. The city headquartered in the city that has ruled over the kings of the earth, that teaches the Babylonian mystery religion. Well, it's pretty obvious. You don't have to guess a whole lot at that. It's clearly identified in Revelation 17, that system, that great city. The Roman system, the Roman church, the Roman Empire. Now, chapter 18, after John had seen this vision of of the woman riding the beast. Now in chapter 18, we focus the attention on in verse 18 that it is the woman represents or is associated with this city, great city. Well, chapter 18 continues that. It said, after these things I saw another angel coming down, and he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. You see, the great city Babylon, verse 10, that mighty city, in 1 hour is her judgment come. What you find as you go through Revelation 17 and Revelation 18 is this system has a religious aspect, but there is a political, military, and economic aspect that is all associated with the city, Babylon the Great. Now, what is going to happen? Well, chapter 17 talks about Christ returning, and the 10 horns here, the 7 heads, the 10 horns represent 10 kings, as we're told in verse 12. These are the ones that are going to fight against Christ when He returns. That's what we're told in verse 14. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. The 10 horns mentioned here in Revelation 17 are the same as the 10 toes mentioned back in Daniel 2 that are going to be smashed, because they're the ones that Christ is going to directly deal with. The Lamb shall overcome them, for He's Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with Him are called and chosen and faithful. Now, we're also told that as we come through, we saw in chapter 18 the destruction of Babylon. In chapter 19, described in the opening portion of the chapter, this heavenly ceremony. And then we find in verse 11, heaven opened and a white horse. The one that sat on it was called Faithful and True. And he is the Word of God, as it mentions in verse 13. The armies of heaven follow him. And what does he do? Well, verse 19, the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered themselves together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that dwell on the face of the earth, those that received the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. These were both cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. Now, what did we read back in Isaiah 14? That the prelude to the earth being at rest was the oppressor ceases and the golden city ceases. When is the oppressor going to cease? Chapter 19 says that Christ is going to throw the beast and the false prophet into the lake of fire, and all their claims of greatness and divinity are going to evaporate very, very quickly, because when they're thrown into the lake of fire, they're going to burn up. It's going to become very apparent that they weren't anything. They were just a couple of mortal men that were strutting around and laying great claims of greatness for themselves. They're going to burn up. That's going to end the argument. The oppressor will have ceased. This great strutting individual who, this pompous Hitler type and this false prophet who claims to be God incarnate are just going to go up in smoke. I can look and say, well, I don't guess they amounted to much. They weren't any different than anybody else. The golden city will have ceased, because we just read in Revelation 18 that great city is cast down. Babylon is fallen. Well, that sets the stage for what comes next in chapter 20 of Revelation. An angel came down, John saw it, and the devil was laid hold of, and the devil is bound up for how long? For 1,000 years. And then John saw, verse 4 of Revelation 20, thrones. And those who sat on the thrones. And judgment was given unto them, governmental authority. These included people who had been beheaded for the witness of Christ and for the Word of God. Those who had not worshipped the beast nor its image. Those who had not received the mark upon their foreheads. They lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he that has part in the first resurrection. On such the second death has no power. They're going to be priests of God and of Christ. They're going to reign with him 1,000 years. Now, Peter said that a day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. Here we find a 1,000-year day during which the saints will rule with Christ. That is a time when the earth will be at rest. It is a millennial Sabbath. Clearly, the implications are preceded by 6 millennial workdays, followed by a millennial Sabbath. That's going to occur at a time when the oppressor is removed and the golden city ceases. Right here tells the story. When Jesus Christ returns, those who are in the first resurrection, blessed and holy is he that's in the first resurrection. The second death has no power over them, because they are raised to immortality. They don't ever have to worry about dying again. Second death has no power over them. Everybody died once. When you come up in the first resurrection, you don't ever have to worry about death, because the second death has no power over you. You're raised to glory. You're raised to immortality. The time setting is very clear. Now, I might just say with that the implications of 2 Peter 3 very clearly are the 7 millennial days. And the 7th millennial day, the day of rest, when the whole earth will be at rest. And there will be rest from sorrow and pain and all of the consequences of sin. Well, any way you want to figure it, we're right toward the end of 6,000 years of human history. Now, I'm not persuaded, and I certainly know that you can't sit down with a pencil and paper and just suddenly figure the magic date and circle the date and say that's exactly when Christ is going to return. If it were that simple, the angels would have figured it out. And Christ made it very plain in Matthew 24 that even the angels in heaven didn't know. Well, the angels can count, and I'm sure they're better mathematicians than you and I are, so if it was only a matter of adding everything up and knowing the exact day, the angels could have figured that out, and they didn't know. But the clear implication of Scripture is that God has a 7,000-year plan. That's the whole context of 2 Peter 3. The idea that somehow everything's just going to drag on and on indefinitely. No, God is going to intervene in judgment. He's not slack concerning His promises. He's right on schedule. A day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. But you see, there are 2 aspects. Christ emphasizes 2 things in Matthew 24 and the parallel accounts. Well, he emphasizes many things, but he emphasizes 2 things about the date of his return. One is that no man knows the day nor the hour, so you better be ready. The other is that there are definite events that set the stage, that are a prelude, and while you can't know the exact day or hour, you can know pretty close. You can see that it's about time. He compared it. He said, you look out at the trees and you see things budding out, and you know that summer's getting near. Winter's passing. We're getting ready for a change of seasons. In the same way, he says, when these things begin to come to pass, then know that it's near. It's at the door. It's getting close. We're getting close to a change of seasons. We're getting close to the end of 6,000 years. We're very close to the end of 6,000 years of human history. It's not very long until that 7th millennial day will begin. Now understand the implications of that. There is a whole society, there's a whole civilization that's going to pass away, and a new civilization that's going to be set up. Now let me call your attention to what we just read, this one verse, Revelation 17:14. We just read it. We talk about the beast power making war with the Lamb. The Lamb will overcome them because He's Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Who is with the Lamb? They that are with Him are called and chosen and faithful. Now, a lot of people have heard the proclamation of the gospel. They have heard the call, the announcement that went forth, proclaiming the gospel message and the warning message. Out of those who have heard the call or the proclamation, there are those who have been chosen, and those of us in this room have been chosen to understand it. No man can come to me, Christ said, except the Spirit of the Father which has sent me draw him. You and I have been chosen to be drawn. God opened your mind. Most of you can look back. You remember a time when the light bulb came on? I do. I remember when all of a sudden it just clicked. It made sense. You remember when it came on, when you began to understand, and the whole thing began to make sense. You began to understand, and you came to a point where you wanted to enter into a relationship with your Creator. You were called and you had been chosen, but notice that's only 2/3 of the way. It's not enough to be called, and it's not even enough to be chosen. Those who are with Christ at His return have been called and chosen and faithful. You see, that's the rest of the story. You and I are going to go through things in the years immediately ahead. You know, we go through trials, and there are different kinds of trials. Some trials are personal trials. It may be family problems, it may be health problems, it may be financial problems, it may be any number of things, personal things. You have all faced some of those things. We've gone through those, and sometimes we look at it. I can look at certain things I've gone through in life and realize some things I brought on myself. As a result of some dumb decision, and you get some consequence. Now, none of us exactly get to choose our trials. It's not like there's a sign-up list on the table. Check off the trials you would like over the next few years. Now, some trials, as I say, we do choose to a degree in the sense that, I do something dumb and I get a consequence and I say, ooh, I guess I brought that on myself. But, sometimes trials come because of choices other people made and you didn't really have much choice in it. They did something. Sometimes just time and chance. You were at the wrong place, the wrong time. Certain circumstances occurred. While we don't get to exactly choose our trials, there's one thing you and I do get to choose. There's one thing that we must choose. And that is, how do we respond to our trials? How do we respond? Now, those that are with Christ have not only been called and chosen, they have been faithful. There are trials we go through that are trials of normal life. There are trials that we're going to see that are going to unfold on this world that represent God's judgment. And we are affected by those things. How do you get through that? How do you handle it in the way that guarantees that you're going to be there among those with Christ at His return? Well, it's interesting. In the book of Hebrews, chapters 10, 11, and 12, focus in on it. Christ said in Matthew 24, he that endures to the end, the same will be saved. Well, he that endures to the end is another way of saying he that is faithful. If you endure to the end, that means you've remained faithful. Now, there's something that's necessary in order to endure, in order to remain faithful. We find, speaking of Moses in Hebrews 11, verse 27, that by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured. How did he endure? As seeing him who's invisible. On down a little later in chapter 12, we talk about Jesus Christ in verse 2, that we're to look to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despised the shame. He sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You see, perhaps the single greatest key to enduring is you see beyond right here, right now. Moses endured as seeing Him who is invisible. If all you see is Pharaoh, then you're going to be intimidated, you're going to be scared, you're going to be discouraged, you're going to be overwhelmed. If you see beyond Pharaoh and see God, well, your whole perspective is different. Jesus Christ endured the cross. How? For the joy that was set before Him. He saw beyond the moment. For the joy that was set before Him, He looked and He saw the reality. And it put everything into perspective. In Hebrews 11, a little earlier, where we read of men and women of faith, in verse 13 of Hebrews 11, we're told these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. There are three things. You see, all of these men and women of faith we read of in Hebrews 11 just a little bit earlier, men like Abel and Enoch and Noah, men like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, right along with Sarah and others, men and women of faith. They're all going to be with Christ at His return because they've not only been called, not only been chosen, they were faithful. They endured. They died in faith. They remained faithful. They endured to the end. And the reason and the way that they did it was they saw the promises afar off, were persuaded of it, and embraced it. So first and foremost, you have to have vision, don't you? You have to see. You have to see the reality of what God offers. You have to see the reality of the plan and the purpose. You have to see the reality. You not only have to see it, you have to be persuaded of it. It's one thing to see it. It's another thing to be fully persuaded. You're convinced. You know it's a fact. You not only saw it, you not only have the picture, you are convinced of it. You believe it. But there's something even beyond believing it, and that is you embrace it. Now, when you embrace somebody, when you embrace something, you're holding it to you. You embrace what you love. When you embrace something, that's because you love it. What you love, you hold on to. It's precious to you. It's dear. So they not only saw the promises, they were persuaded of them, absolutely convinced that it was a fact, and they embraced them. That's what enables us to not only be called and chosen, but to remain faithful. You know, John tells us in 1 John chapter 2, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15, he says, love not the world. Don't be in love with this world, this civilization, this society. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Why? Well, for all that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, it's not of the Father, it's of the world. This civilization is based on the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. That doesn't flow from God. And here's the rest of the story. The world passes away, and the lust thereof. But he that does the will of God abides forever. You know, we embrace what we love. We hold on to what we love. If you and I are in love with this world, then we're going to embrace it. We're going to hold on to it. And if we embrace this world, if we're in love with this world, then when the world passes away, we'll pass away with it because we'll be holding on. You can't hold on to this world and hold on to the kingdom of God at the same time. Because the world passes away. The whole basis of this world's civilization is going to pass from the scene. There's a whole new civilization coming about in a matter of a few years from now. Jesus Christ is going to stand on the Mount of Olives, and the mountain is going to cleave in two. There are going to be those who are with Christ, and the ones who are there with Him are going to be those who have been called and chosen and faithful. They've endured to the end. And they're there with Him, and they're there to have part in establishing a whole new civilization. You know, back in the days of Daniel chapter 2, right at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he was given information from God to make something very plain, and that is the fact that he held his office because God had placed him there. Not only that, but he held it temporarily, and there were going to arise other kingdoms after him, and God could already foresee what they were. And ultimately, God was going to set up a kingdom, and it would not come to an end. Well, you know, when you go on into chapter 3 of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar hadn't really gotten the point. He set up a big image. He wanted everybody to bow down and worship it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wouldn't. Nebuchadnezzar gave them a choice. He said, you can bow down and worship the image, or I'm going to throw you into that fiery furnace. What God can deliver you out of my hands? Oh, that's your question. What God can deliver us out of your hands? Well, we'll show you. And so the God of heaven showed him what God could deliver them out of his hands. Nebuchadnezzar got a lesson in the power of the Creator. Now, when you get into chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar had another dream. And he saw a big tree, and the tree was cut down, and the stump was left, and it was banded. He was disturbed by that dream. And Daniel said, Daniel was called in, he said, there's a God in heaven that's a revealer of secrets. And what is going to happen is that your kingdom is temporary. You're going to be driven forth from among men. You're going to be like a wild animal, roaming the woods and the meadows for 7 years. And sure enough, that was exactly what happened. Because you're going to learn that all that walk in pride, God is able to abase. Well, Nebuchadnezzar learned his lesson. He came back, was on the throne for a few years. He died. When we pick up the story next in Daniel 5, we read of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar. And we read of the final day of Babylon. Belshazzar was holding a big festival celebrating the invincibility of Babylon, because the Persians had a siege around Babylon, and he was convinced that nobody could take Babylon. He was having a party celebrating the invincibility of Babylon, and he was so emboldened that he sent over to the treasure house of Marduk and had the sacred vessels of the temple brought in, and they were going to drink out of them, drinking to the gods of gold and silver and wood and stone and the whole thing. Well, you remember the story. Handwriting on the wall. Daniel came in and he reminded Belshazzar of what his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had gone through, and how Nebuchadnezzar had learned that all that walk in pride God is able to abase. And he told Belshazzar, he said, "You have not heeded that lesson, though you knew it." You knew the story, you heard it from your grandfather, and you haven't remembered it, you haven't listened. Your heart is lifted up this very night. Your kingdom is going to be taken. And it was. You see, God made it very plain at the beginning of the reign of Babylon, from the start to the finish of that kingdom, that it was a temporary blip on the screen. God brought it into being, and He caused it to pass from the wayside. He caused it to pass by the wayside. And that God saw the rise and fall of empires right on down to the times immediately ahead of us when the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will never be removed. The future, the outcome of the events that are going on in the world scene, that is sure. Those things are set. God has a plan and a purpose that He is working out. Events in Europe, events in the Middle East, natural disasters, things that are happening here, events with the American economy, things all over the world are all gradually, the pieces of the puzzle are coming into place. Now the time is going to come, as the stage is set, the time is going to come when events are going to begin to unfold so quickly that it will make our heads swim. Now, I'm here to tell you, brethren, at that point, it will be very apparent how we have used our preparation time. You know, when Jesus ascended to heaven, the apostles and the other disciples were gathered and they watched. And they stood staring and gawking as He disappeared into the clouds. The angel told them, said, "Look, this same Jesus is going to so come again in like manner as you saw Him go." They were told, "Go back to Jerusalem and wait until you're imbued with power from on high." Now, that occurred 10 days later. But they weren't told in advance that it was going to occur 10 days later. They were told to go and wait. What did they do in that interim? Well, you can read it there in Acts chapter 1. They continued with one accord in prayer and supplication. They were focused on God. They were focused on the calling that they had. You can read it there in Acts 1. And then we're told in Acts 2, verse 1, that when the day of Pentecost was fully come, they were all assembled with one accord in one place. And suddenly, there came a sound of a rushing mighty wind. When God's time came, suddenly it came. What occurred afterward was not something they had worked themselves up into some emotional frenzy. They were spiritually prepared when God's time came. Now, one of the things I did when I was in Charlotte just over a week ago was I taped a sermon specifically for the day of Pentecost. And I go into some of this in a little more detail in the day of Pentecost, but you know, when you go back to the prophecies of Joel 2 and Joel 3, it's very clear that the main context is the end time. Just read through it. Joel chapter 2 flows right into Joel chapter 3 and the armies gathering in the valley of Jehoshaphat. But you know, Peter quoted much of the latter part of Joel 2, stopped in the middle of a verse, but he quoted much of that portion of Joel 2, and he applied it to the events that occurred there in Acts chapter 2. Now, one of the things you find in Scripture, speaking of, and it's mentioned in Joel, it's mentioned in Jeremiah, mentioned in other places, that the harvest this season in ancient Israel, the harvest in ancient Israel were dependent on a former rain and a latter rain, two rainy periods. The former rain and the latter rain. I submit to you that the miraculous outpouring, the dramatic miraculous outpouring of the Holy Spirit on Acts 2, recorded in Acts 2, that Peter quoted the verses from Joel 2 and said this is a fulfillment. That simply represented the former rain, the early outpouring. If you read the whole thing in context, continuing right on down into chapter 3, it's very apparent that there is also a latter rain. What happened back then in Acts 2 is going to occur. Not every detail exactly the same, but overall, it's going to occur. There is going to come a latter day, dramatic outpouring. God is going to finish the work. Paul says so in Romans. He will finish the work and He will cut it short in righteousness. That's simply going to happen. The Scripture says so. Those that know their God will be strong and do exploits. Daniel says so. Those that have endured to the end, those that are not only called and chosen but remain faithful, will be with Jesus Christ and will have to do with bringing in a new world, a new civilization. Brethren, you and I are in a time that is a prelude. Now, we will either use this time in a way that draws us closer to God, makes us vessels fit for the Master's use. When God's time comes, we will be ready. Or when God's time comes, we'll be chasing after trying to catch up. The time is going to come. And it's going to come very quickly. When you look at events that occurred in Europe with the collapse of the wall, you look at events, the whole tenor of world events changed in a matter of days. When you look at this natural disaster, just within a matter of minutes, people's whole lives changed. Dramatic things happen. When God's time comes, things will change. This world, this civilization, this society is going to be swept away just as surely as some of those Pacific villages were swept away in the tsunami. They're going to be swept away. It's going to be, for many people, a time of perplexity, a time that they don't understand. You and I can understand, should understand. We have the story written in advance. But you know, one of the most important aspects of that is the fact that this world is going to pass away. This civilization is coming to an end. The God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that will never be removed. Are you and I preparing ourselves? Do we not only see it, but we're persuaded of it, we're convinced? And not only are we convinced, we embrace it, because you can't embrace the world and the kingdom of God at the same time. The two aren't compatible. What are you and I in love with? Because what we're in love with will determine what we embrace. And what we embrace will determine whether we're a part of what will endure forever or what will be swept away, just as surely as that tidal wave swept away whole villages. Whole aspects of civilization were just simply gone. We need to understand the times in which we're living. We need to examine in our own lives. We need to examine the patterns in our life. We need to examine what we're doing, what we love, what we're embracing. Because, my brethren, we stand at a crossroads in history. We stand in the prelude to the greatest change in the affairs of the world that has ever been. We stand right at the time of the prelude to the kingdom of God, when the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be removed.
Additional programs and literature available at hwalibrary.com.